Steel met steel in the dark of the training yard, and Kian Ashriver did not blink. 3 warriors circled him at once, each one a seasoned fighter from a rival pack sent to test the new Alpha King, before the northern packs would agree to kneel. Sparks flew as blades clashed under torchlight. A crowd of wolves and warriors stood at the edges of the yard, silent, waiting to see if the rumors were true, that this young king was strong enough to hold the throne his father had died defending. Kian moved like water, finding the fastest path downhill. He ducked beneath a swinging blade, caught the wrist of the second attacker, and turned the man's own weight against him, sending him crashing into the dirt. The third warrior lunged from behind, but Kian had already shifted his stance, and within 2 heartbeats, all 3 men lay defeated at his feet, breathing hard, weapons scattered across the packed earth. The crowd erupted into cheers. Kian did not smile. He simply looked at the fallen warriors, then turned toward the elders who had arranged the test, his jaw tight with the same cold control that had defined him since the day he took the throne. "Tell your alphas," he said, his voice carrying easily across the yard, "that the North does not bow to threats. It answers them." The elders exchanged uneasy glances before bowing low and retreating into the crowd. Kian sheathed his blade and walked toward the castle steps, his wolf, Thren, humming with satisfaction beneath his skin. To everyone watching, King Kian Ashriver was untouchable. Fear did not exist in him. It could not exist in him. That was the story the packs told, the story that kept rival alphas from testing his borders and kept his own people sleeping soundly at night. It was, of course, a lie. Only Kian knew the truth, and he intended to keep it that way until the day he died. He climbed the stone steps of Blackridge Castle 2 at a time, nodding briefly to the guards stationed at the entrance. Inside, the halls were warm with firelight, the scent of roasted meat and mountain herbs drifting from the kitchens below. Servants bowed as he passed, and pack members lowered their eyes out of respect, the same way they always did. Kian barely noticed anymore. He had grown used to being feared and admired in the same breath, used to the weight of hundreds of lives resting on his shoulders, used to being the calm center that held the storm of the northern territories together. It was the actual storms that broke him. He reached his private chamber and closed the door firmly behind him, letting out a breath he had been holding since the fight ended. His shoulders sagged, just slightly, just enough that no one but the empty room could see it. He crossed to the window and looked out at the darkening sky, where thick gray clouds had begun rolling in over the mountain peaks, swallowing the last light of evening. His stomach tightened. Thren stirred uneasily inside him, a slow ripple of unease that Kian had felt 1,000 times before and had never once managed to control. It always started the same way, a change in the air, a drop in pressure, the distant smell of rain on stone. Long before the first rumble of thunder ever sounded, Thren already knew, and Thren already began to panic. Kian pressed his palm flat against the cold glass of the window, trying to steady his breathing the way he always did, counting the seconds between each breath, forcing his heartbeat to slow. It was a ritual he had practiced since he was a boy of 9 years old, hiding beneath his bed during a summer storm, while his father pounded on the door, demanding he come out and behave like the future king he was meant to be. His father had never understood. No alpha ever could. A wolf's fear was supposed to mirror its human half, not overpower it. A wolf was supposed to be a source of strength, a second heartbeat that made its human braver, faster, harder to break. That was the natural order of things, the bond every shifter was taught to trust from birth. But Thren was different. Thren was strong in every other way, fierce in a hunt, unshaken in a real fight, loyal beyond question. Yet when the sky darkened and the thunder came, something ancient and terrified clawed its way to the surface, and no amount of will could hold it back forever. Kian had learned to hide it well. He scheduled council meetings during storm season for the depths of the castle, where thick stone walls muffled the sound. He trained his guards to expect his sudden disappearances without asking questions. He had built an entire life around concealing one single truth, because if his enemies ever learned that the Alpha King's wolf could be reduced to a trembling mess by nothing more than rain and lightning, they would use it. They would circle him the way wolves circled a wounded animal, and everything he had built, every alliance, every border secured, every life under his protection, would be at risk. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance, still far off, still hours away by the smell of it. Kian closed his eyes and steadied himself against the window frame. He had time. He always had time, and he always used it the same way, retreating to the deepest, quietest part of the castle, before the storm arrived in full force, locking himself away where no one could see what happened to a king when the sky turned against him. Tonight, though, something felt different. The wind outside picked up faster than it should have, bending the tall pines that lined the castle's eastern ridge. Kian frowned, watching the clouds roll in with unusual speed, dark and heavy, swollen with a storm that seemed to be gathering strength far quicker than any he had tracked before. Thren's unease sharpened into something closer to alarm, and Kian felt his pulse quicken in response. An uncomfortable, unfamiliar edge creeping into a fear that had always, at least, been predictable. He turned from the window and moved quickly through his chamber, gathering the reports he had meant to review that evening, planning to retreat early to the lower halls before the storm rolled directly overhead. As Alpha King, he could not risk being caught unprepared, not even by his own body's failures. A knock came at his door. "Enter," Kian said, his voice returning instantly to its usual commanding calm. One of his advisors, an older wolf named Edric, who had served under Kian's father for decades, stepped inside and bowed. "My king, the healer wishes to speak with you regarding the wounded from this morning's border patrol. She says 2 of the men need your approval to be moved to the recovery wing." Kian's brow lifted slightly. "The new healer? The human girl?" "Yes, my king, Elara." Kian had heard the name mentioned in passing over the last few weeks, though he had not yet met her directly. She had come to the pack under difficult circumstances, the sole survivor of a border skirmish that had claimed her family, taken in by his people out of duty, and, if the reports were accurate, because she had shown remarkable skill in treating the wounded, despite having no formal training beyond what she'd learned from her own mother. "Send her in," Kian said, setting the reports aside. A brief conversation about wounded soldiers would be a welcome distraction from the storm building outside, and it would take only a few moments before he needed to retreat to safety regardless. Edric nodded and disappeared, returning a short while later with a young woman trailing quietly behind him. She was smaller than Kian expected, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, her clothes plain and practical, stained faintly at the sleeves with the telltale marks of her work. She did not lower her eyes the way most of his people did. Instead, she looked directly at him, her expression calm and steady, as if kings were no more intimidating to her than any other patient waiting on her attention. "My king," she said, offering a respectful nod rather than a full bow. "Thank you for seeing me." "Edric tells me 2 of the wounded need to be moved," Kian said, studying her with mild curiosity. Most people in his presence fumbled their words or trembled slightly, unable to help it. Elara did neither. "Yes. Garen and Percy, from this morning's patrol. Their wounds are healing well, but they need quieter quarters, away from the noise of the main hall, if they're going to recover fully. I wanted your approval before moving them into the East Wing recovery rooms." "Granted," Kian said simply. "You didn't need to ask me directly for something so small." "I wanted to be certain," Elara said. "Given how close the East Wing is to your own chambers, I did not want to assume." Kian almost smiled at that, the closest he had come to genuine amusement in weeks. "You assumed correctly that I would grant it. You did not need to assume anything about proximity. I trust my healer's judgment on where the wounded should rest." Something flickered across her expression, surprise perhaps, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Thank you, my king." Outside, the wind howled harder against the castle walls, and a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the mountains, closer now than it had been minutes before. Kian felt his chest tighten instantly, Thren's unease spiking sharply beneath his skin. He kept his face perfectly still, the same mask he had worn for over a decade, but his hand curled slightly at his side, fingers pressing into his palm. Alara's eyes flicked toward the window at the sound of thunder, then back to him, and for just a moment, Kian wondered if she had noticed anything at all. But her expression remained unreadable, professional, giving nothing away. "Is there anything else, my king?" she asked. "No," Kian said, perhaps too quickly. "That will be all. See to your patients." She bowed her head again and turned to leave, her footsteps quiet against the stone floor. Kian watched her go, an odd, unfamiliar awareness settling over him, though he pushed it aside almost immediately, his attention pulled back to the growing storm outside his window. He had perhaps 2 hours before it broke fully over the castle. 2 hours to retreat to the lower halls, to lock himself away where the thunder's sound would be muffled enough to bear, where no one would witness the Alpha King brought low by nothing more than rain and lightning. Tonight, he told himself, would be no different from any other storm. He was wrong. By the time the first true crack of thunder split the sky 2 hours later, Kian was no longer in the lower halls where he had planned to hide. A sudden council matter regarding a border dispute had pulled him into an emergency meeting that ran far longer than expected, and by the time it ended, the storm had already arrived in full, violent force, rain lashing against the castle walls, lightning flashing bright enough to illuminate the halls in sharp white bursts. Thren was no longer simply uneasy. Thren was terrified, clawing desperately at the edges of Kian's control, and for the first time in years, Kian felt that control beginning to slip entirely. He excused himself from the council chamber with a curt word about urgent business, his calm expression cracking at the edges as he strode quickly through the corridors, searching for anywhere quiet enough, dark enough, far enough from the storm's fury to let him ride out what was coming. His hands had begun to tremble, his vision blurred at the edges as Thren pushed harder against his hold, desperate and afraid, in a way that made rational thought increasingly difficult. Another crack of thunder, closer this time, shook the very stones beneath his feet. Kian stumbled, gripping the wall for support, his breathing ragged. He needed somewhere to hide, somewhere no guard would think to check, somewhere the sound would not reach him so sharply. His mind, fraying at the edges, could not locate the lower halls. Every corridor blurred together into the same gray stone, the same flickering torchlight, the same growing dread. He turned a corner blindly and found himself in the east wing, the recovery halls quiet and mostly empty at this late hour. A door stood slightly ajar just ahead, a soft light glowing from within. Without thinking, without any conscious decision at all, Kian pushed through it and closed it firmly behind him, his back pressing against the wood as another crash of thunder rattled the windows. It was only then, breathing hard in the dim candlelight, that he realized he was not alone. Alara sat upright on her narrow bed, a book resting forgotten in her lap, her eyes wide with shock at the sight of the Alpha King standing pressed against her door, chest heaving, his golden eyes flickering unnaturally in the candlelight. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the rain hammering against the window and the ragged pull of his breath. "My king," she said carefully, setting the book aside. Kian did not answer. His body was rigid, one hand still gripping the door behind him, as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. Another crack of thunder sounded outside, and Alara watched, stunned, as the powerful, unshakable ruler of the northern Pax flinched violently, his shoulders curling inward, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. She had heard stories about him since arriving at Blackridge, the same stories everyone told. Fearless in battle, cold in judgment, untouched by weakness of any kind. The man standing in her doorway looked nothing like that story. He looked like someone drowning, desperately trying not to let anyone see it. "Kian," she said again, dropping the formal title without thinking, her voice softer this time. "You're safe here. Whatever this is, you're safe." His eyes snapped to hers, sharp and startled, as though the sound of his own name, without a title attached, had cut through some of the fog clouding his mind. For a long moment he said nothing, simply staring at her with an expression caught somewhere between fear and disbelief that anyone would dare speak to him so plainly. Lightning flashed outside, briefly lighting the room in stark white, followed almost immediately by another rolling crash of thunder. Kian's knees buckled slightly, and he slid down the length of the door until he was crouched on the floor, one hand pressed against his temple, his breathing coming in short, uneven bursts. Alara did not scream. She did not call for guards. She did not do any of the things a lesser healer or a more frightened person might have done. Instead, she rose slowly from her bed and crossed the small room, kneeling down in front of him at a careful distance, the same way she might approach a wounded animal that did not yet trust her hands. "Look at me," she said gently. "Not at the window. Look at me." It took a long moment, but eventually, his gaze lifted from the floor and found hers, wolf gold and wide, with something that looked dangerously close to shame. "Breathe with me," she continued, keeping her voice low and even. In for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Just like that. You don't have to explain anything right now. Just breathe. To her surprise, he did. His chest rose and fell in halting, uneven rhythm at first, matching her counted breaths as thunder continued to roll outside the window. Slowly, painfully slowly, his shoulders began to lower from around his ears, and the wild, panicked light in his eyes dimmed just slightly, replaced by something more like exhaustion. Minutes passed this way, the storm raging outside, while the two of them sat on the floor of her small room, breathing in careful rhythm together. Ilara did not ask questions. She did not press him for explanations or comment on what she was witnessing. She simply stayed present, steady, and calm, the way she had learned to be with every frightened patient who had ever come through her care. Eventually, the worst of the storm began to pass, the thunder growing more distant, the rain softening against the window. Kian's breathing evened out fully, and he sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the floor between them, as though gathering the strength to speak. "You should call the guards," he said finally, his voice rough. "Report what you saw. It's what any loyal subject would do. Is that what you want me to do?" He looked up at her sharply. "It doesn't matter what I want. It matters what's right. What you've seen tonight could be used against me, against this entire pack. Enemies would love nothing more than to learn the Alpha King's wolf can be broken by something as simple as a storm." "I'm not interested in breaking anyone," Ilara said quietly. "I'm a healer. My job is to help people, not expose them." "This isn't a wound you can bandage," Kian said, a note of bitterness creeping into his voice. "This is weakness. Plain and simple, a king cannot afford weakness." Ilara studied him for a long moment before responding, her expression thoughtful rather than pitying, which he seemed to appreciate, even if he did not say so. "Fear isn't weakness," she said. "Everyone fears something. I've treated warriors twice your size who couldn't stand the sight of their own blood. I've treated elders who panic at the thought of dying alone. Fear doesn't make someone less capable, it makes them human, or in your case, still capable of feeling something real beneath all that armor you wear." "You don't understand," Kian said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. "I've spent my entire life proving I don't have weaknesses. My father built an empire on the idea that our family was untouchable. If word gets out that his son trembles at the sound of thunder, everything he built could unravel." "Then it stays between us," Ilara said simply. "I have no interest in unraveling anything you've built, and for what it's worth, my king, hiding in my room during a storm, is not exactly the mark of a weak man. A weak man wouldn't have made it this far without anyone noticing at all." Kian looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, surprise perhaps, or the first flicker of relief he had allowed himself to feel in years. "Why are you helping me? You barely know me." "Because that's what I do," Ilara said. "I help people who are hurting, whether the wound is on their skin or somewhere else. Tonight, yours happened to be somewhere else." The rain had softened to a gentle patter against the window now, the worst of the storm, well behind them. Kian rose slowly to his feet, steadying himself against the doorframe for a moment, before straightening fully, his usual composure returning bit by bit, though something in his posture remained looser than before, as though a weight he had carried for a very long time had eased, even if only slightly. "I would ask," he said carefully, "that you keep tonight between us." "You don't need to ask," Ilara said. "I already told you it stays here." He studied her a moment longer, as though searching for some hidden motive, some angle she might be working, but found nothing in her steady expression, except quiet sincerity. It unsettled him more than he expected, being read so easily, being trusted so freely by someone who owed him nothing, and stood to gain nothing from her silence. "Thank you," he said finally, the words unfamiliar in his mouth, rarely spoken, and even more rarely meant. "You should rest," Ilara said. "The storm will likely pass fully within the hour, but you look like you haven't slept properly in longer than that." Kian almost laughed at the bluntness of the observation, a short, surprised huff of breath that carried none of his usual restraint. "You're very direct for someone speaking to their king." "I'm a healer first," Ilara said. "Kings get sick too. They just don't like being told so." This time he did laugh, quiet and brief, but genuine, the sound strange and unfamiliar even to his own ears. Ilara allowed herself a small smile in response. The first real warmth she had shown him since he'd stumbled through her door in a state of near collapse. "I should return to my chambers," Kian said, moving toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle, glancing back at her. "Alara." "Yes, my king?" "Just Kian, when it's only the two of us," he said. "You've earned that much tonight." She nodded once, and he slipped out into the quiet corridor, the storm finally fading into a distant rumble somewhere beyond the mountains. He walked back toward his own chambers slower than usual, his mind turning over everything that had happened, the fear, the shame, and unexpectedly, the strange, steady comfort of being seen at his most vulnerable, and not being judged for it. Thren, for the first time in longer than Kian could remember, settled quietly beneath his skin, calm and undisturbed, as though something in him recognized that the danger, whatever form it usually took, had passed without any lasting damage this time. Kian told himself it meant nothing, a moment of weakness witnessed by a stranger who happened to be kind, nothing more. He would come to realize, in the weeks that followed, just how wrong that assumption truly was. 3 weeks passed before the next storm rolled in, and in that time, Kian found himself thinking about Alara more often than he cared to admit. He told himself it was nothing unusual. She was, after all, a member of his pack now, someone who worked tirelessly in the recovery wing and whose skill with herbs and wound care had already earned quiet praise from the other healers. It was reasonable, he reasoned, for a king to take note of a valuable member of his household. It had nothing to do with the calm certainty in her voice as she'd counted breaths with him on her bedroom floor, or the way she had looked at him without a trace of fear or pity, only steady understanding. He avoided the East Wing during that time, partly out of duty and partly, if he was honest with himself, out of uncertainty about how to act around someone who had seen him at his very worst. Kings did not typically owe anyone gratitude for witnessing a moment of weakness. Kings were not supposed to feel grateful at all. Yet gratitude was exactly what stirred in his chest each time her name crossed his mind. The council kept him occupied through those weeks regardless, border disputes with the eastern territories growing more tense by the day. A neighboring pack, the Draven Line, had begun pushing their patrols further into contested land, testing how far they could go before the northern packs responded with force. Kian spent long hours in meetings, reviewing maps, listening to his generals argue over strategy, all while the pressure of holding his territory together weighed heavier on his shoulders than usual. It was during one such meeting, deep in discussion over troop placements along the eastern ridge, that Edric leaned close and murmured something that pulled Kian's attention sharply away from the map spread across the table. "My king, the weather scouts report a storm system building over the mountains. A significant one, larger than we've seen this season. It's expected to reach us within 2 days." Kian's stomach tightened immediately, though he kept his expression perfectly neutral, nodding, as though the information meant nothing more than any other logistical detail. Nodded. "Continue with the troop assessment." The meeting dragged on for another hour, but Kian's mind kept drifting, unbidden, to the storm gathering somewhere beyond the horizon, and to the quiet room in the East Wing, where he had found an unexpected refuge weeks earlier. He told himself he would handle this storm the way he always had before Alara, retreating to the lower halls, weathering it alone as he had for over a decade. He was fairly certain that was a lie even as he thought it. 2 days later, the sky darkened early, thick clouds rolling over the mountain peaks with an ominous weight that even the pack's oldest elders remarked upon uneasily. Kian felt the change the moment the air pressure shifted, a familiar tightness gathering in his chest, hours before the first distant rumble ever sounded. Thren stirred immediately, restless and wary, sensing the storm's approach with an instinct far sharper than any human sense could offer. Kian spent the afternoon finishing what business he could, forcing himself through council matters and border reports with mechanical focus, all while counting down the hours until the storm would fully arrive. By early evening, the wind had picked up considerably, rattling the shutters of the castle and bending the tall pines along the ridge into wild, sweeping arcs. He made his decision an hour before the rain began, telling himself it was simply the most practical option, the quietest place in the castle, nothing more significant than that. He made his way through the corridors with deliberate calm, nodding to guards and servants as he passed, giving no outward sign that anything unusual occupied his thoughts. When he reached the East Wing, he paused outside Alara's door for a long moment, his hand hovering just above the wood. It felt different this time, deliberate rather than desperate, a choice made with clear mind rather than one forced upon him by panic. He knocked softly. The door opened a moment later, and Alara stood there, mild surprise crossing her face before settling into something more like quiet understanding. She glanced past him toward the darkening sky visible through the corridor windows, then back to him. "I take it the scouts were right about the storm," she said. "They usually are," Kian replied. "I wanted to ask, rather than simply show up unannounced this time, if I might wait out the worst of it here. I understand if you'd prefer otherwise." Something in her expression softened at that, perhaps surprised that the Alpha King had bothered to ask permission at all, rather than simply assuming his rank granted him whatever he wanted. "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I was actually about to make tea. Would you like some?" The offer struck him as oddly ordinary, considering the circumstances, and he found himself nodding before he'd fully considered the strangeness of the Alpha King sitting down for tea in his healer's modest quarters. "Yes, thank you." They settled into an easy quiet as she prepared the tea over a small burner near the window, the domestic simplicity of the scene at odds with everything Kian's life usually involved. He watched her move about the small space with practiced efficiency, noting the careful order of her herbs and supplies lining one wall, the well-worn book still sitting on her bed from weeks earlier, a life built from modest means, but arranged with clear intention and care. "You don't have family here," he said, the words leaving him before he'd fully decided to speak them. "I read the reports when you first arrived, but I never asked you directly. I'm sorry for your loss." Alara's hands paused briefly over the teapot before continuing their work, her expression unreadable for a moment. "Thank you. It's been almost a year now. Some days it feels longer. Some days it feels like it happened yesterday. How did you end up here, specifically? There were other packs closer to your family's territory." "Your patrol found me," she said simply. "I was half frozen, trying to make my way toward anywhere that might take in a stranger with no pack of her own. Your soldiers could have left me. Plenty of packs wouldn't have bothered helping a human with no ties to their territory. But they brought me here instead, and your healers taught me what I didn't already know, and gave me purpose when I had none left." Kian considered this for a long moment, an unfamiliar warmth settling in his chest at the thought that his pack, his people, had shown this kind of quiet mercy without needing his direct order to do so. "I'm glad they did." "So am I," Alara said, handing him a cup of tea before settling onto the edge of her bed, leaving the single chair in the room for him. "Though I imagine you didn't come here tonight to discuss my history." Kian allowed a small, wry smile at that, taking the offered chair. "No. Though I find myself less opposed to the conversation than I expected to be." Thunder rumbled in the distance then, still far off but growing closer, and Kian felt the familiar tightness return to his chest, though notably less severe than it had been weeks earlier. Alara noticed the shift in his posture immediately, her healer's instincts sharp even in casual conversation. "It's still a while off," she said gently, "but if you'd like to talk through it before it arrives, sometimes that helps more than waiting in silence." "Talk through what, exactly?" "Whatever this fear actually is," Alara said. "You don't have to. But sometimes naming something makes it smaller than letting it live only in silence." Kian turned his teacup slowly in his hands, considering her words. He had never spoken of it to anyone. Not his father, not his advisors, not even the healers who had treated him as a child, before anyone understood what was truly happening. The idea of explaining it now, to this quiet, steady woman who had already seen the worst of it, felt both terrifying and, oddly, like relief. "When I was young," he began slowly, "before I understood how to control my shift at all, a storm caught our hunting party far from shelter. My father's men were forced to take cover in a shallow cave, and lightning struck close enough to split the tree just outside the entrance. I remember the sound more than anything, a crack so loud it felt like the world itself had broken open. Thren has never forgotten that sound. Every storm since brings it back." Alara listened without interrupting, her expression calm and attentive, giving him the space to continue without pressure. "My father believed fear was something to be beaten out of a wolf, not understood," Kian continued, his voice quieter now. "He tried everything. Forced me outside during storms as a boy, hoping I would grow used to it. It never worked. It only made things worse, made Thren associate the storms with punishment, as well as the memory of that lightning strike. By the time I was old enough to hide it properly, I had already learned that showing weakness, any weakness, was dangerous. That sounds like a very lonely way to grow up, Elara said softly. It was practical, Kian said, though the words lacked their usual conviction. It can be both, she replied. Practical and lonely aren't opposites. Thunder rolled again, closer this time, and Kian's hand tightened slightly around his teacup. Elara set her own cup aside and moved to sit on the floor near his chair, not touching him, simply present. The same steady calm she had offered weeks earlier settling over the room. You don't have to fight it alone tonight, she said. That's really all I'm offering. Not a cure, just company. Kian looked down at her, something shifting behind his composed expression, a crack forming in the careful mask he had worn his entire adult life. Why does that matter to you? I'm your king. You owe me nothing beyond your duties. Maybe I just think everyone deserves company during their storms, Elara said. Literal or otherwise, it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. The rain began in earnest a short while later, and true to her word, Elara stayed beside him through it, her calm presence a steady anchor, as the storm raged outside. This time, Kian's hands did not tremble quite as violently. This time, Thren settled more easily beneath his skin, soothed by a presence that had, in the span of a few short weeks, become unexpectedly familiar. By the time the storm passed fully, well past midnight, Kian realized with quiet unease that he no longer thought of these visits as simply practical necessity. Something else had begun to take root, something he was not yet ready to name, though Thren, in the deep instinctive way wolves always seem to know such things long before their human halves caught up, had already begun to understand it perfectly well. The season turned colder, and with it came more frequent storms rolling down from the northern peaks, each one arriving with less warning than the last. What had once been a rare, dreaded event became, for Kian, something almost predictable in its rhythm. The scouts would report a system building. Kian would finish whatever business demanded his attention, and by evening he would find himself walking the familiar path to the east wing, where Elara would already have tea prepared, as though she had simply come to expect him. Neither of them spoke openly about what these visits had become. There was no formal agreement, no spoken understanding beyond the original promise of silence, yet the pattern held steady through the following weeks, storm after storm, each visit a little easier than the one before it. Kian noticed things about Elara he hadn't allowed himself to notice at first. The way she hummed softly to herself while grinding herbs into paste for the wounded. The small, private smile she wore when one of her patients recovered fully, as though each healed wound were a personal victory. The quiet stubbornness in her voice whenever one of the pack elders questioned her methods, never raising her voice, but never backing down from her judgment either. He also noticed the way Thren responded to her, a response entirely separate from Kian's own conscious thoughts. Long before Kian arrived at her door during a storm, Thren had already begun to calm at the mere thought of her presence, as though some part of him recognized in Elara something Kian's rational mind was still working to understand. One evening, nearly 2 months after the first storm had driven him into her room, Kian found himself lingering in the east wing, even though the sky remained perfectly clear. He told himself he had simply come to check on the recovering patients under her care, a reasonable duty for any king concerned with his people's welfare. Elara, however, saw through the excuse the moment he appeared in her doorway. "There's no storm tonight," she said, arching an eyebrow as she looked up from the herbs she'd been sorting at her small table. "I know," Kian admitted, feeling oddly exposed by the observation. "I wanted to see how Garen and Percy were healing. And, if I'm honest, I wanted to see you as well." Elara's hands stilled over the herbs for a moment, and a faint color rose in her cheeks, though she quickly returned her attention to her work, perhaps to hide it. "Garen and Percy are both healing well. They should be back on light duty within the week." "Good," Kian said, stepping further into the room, though he remained standing near the door, uncertain of his welcome, without the excuse of a storm to justify his presence. "And you? How are you finding life here, now that some time has passed?" "Better than I expected," Elara said honestly. "The other healers have been kind. The pack has been generous. More generous than I had any right to expect as an outsider. And," she added, glancing up at him with a small, teasing smile, "I've found myself with an unusual, and occasionally demanding new patient." Kian huffed out a quiet laugh, moving to take the chair across from her small table. "Demanding, am I?" "Terribly," she said, though her tone carried clear affection rather than complaint. Though I suppose I don't mind the company as much as I probably should. They fell into easy conversation after that, discussing pack matters at first, then drifting into lighter topics, childhood memories, favorite foods, the strange habits of the other healers Alara worked alongside. Kian found himself laughing more freely than he had in years, the careful mask he wore for every other moment of his life slipping away entirely in her presence. It was during one such evening, weeks later, that Edric found reason to mention the pattern that had, without either of them fully realizing it, become impossible to ignore. "My king," Edric said carefully, catching him alone in the corridor one afternoon. "Forgive my boldness, but your visits to the East Wing have become rather frequent. The staff have begun to notice." Kian felt a flicker of unease at the observation, though he kept his expression neutral. "I've been checking on the recovery of the wounded from the border patrols. It's reasonable for a king to take interest in his soldiers' well-being." "Of course, my king," Edric said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced by the explanation. "I only mention it because word travels quickly within these walls, and not everyone will interpret your interest so generously." "Meaning?" "Meaning some among the council may begin to ask questions about your relationship with the healer Alara specifically, rather than your general concern for the wounded," Edric said carefully. "Particularly given her status as human, and given the political considerations regarding your future mate that some of the Elder Council have been quietly discussing for some time now." Kian's jaw tightened at the reminder. He had known, of course, that pressure would eventually mount regarding his choice of mate, a decision every Alpha eventually had to make to secure the future of their line and strengthen alliances between packs. He had simply managed to avoid the topic thus far, too consumed with the daily demands of rule to give the matter serious thought. "I appreciate the warning, Edric," Kian said finally. "I'll be more mindful." But mindfulness proved difficult in practice. The following week brought another storm, sudden and violent, catching Kian in the middle of an important trade negotiation with a visiting delegation from a southern pack. He excused himself as gracefully as he could manage, his control already beginning to fray at the edges, and made his way quickly toward the East Wing, old habit overriding any caution Edric's warning might have instilled. Alara opened her door before he even knocked, as though she had sensed the storm's approach and anticipated his arrival. "Come in," she said simply, stepping aside. This time, once inside, Kian did not immediately retreat into silence or focus solely on managing Thren's rising panic. Instead, as the first crack of thunder sounded outside, he found himself reaching for her hand, without fully deciding to do so, an instinctive gesture that surprised them both. Alara did not pull away. She simply laced her fingers through his, her palm warm and steady against his own trembling grip, and guided him gently to sit beside her on the edge of her bed, rather than the usual chair.
"You're allowed to hold on," she said quietly, as thunder rolled again outside.
"It doesn't make you weaker. It just makes you not alone." Kian's breath caught, something in his chest loosening at the simple permission in her words. Permission he had never once been offered in his entire life, not by his father, not by any advisor, not by anyone who had ever known the truth of what happened inside him during a storm. "Alara," he said quietly, his voice rough, "I don't know what this is anymore. What's happening between us?" "I don't either," she admitted, just as quietly. "But I know I look forward to these evenings more than I probably should." Storm or not. The rain intensified outside, but for the first time since childhood, Kian found the sound almost bearable, softened not by the thick stone walls of the lower halls, but by the steady warmth of the hand holding his own. Thren, sensing the shift in his human half's emotional state, calmed almost entirely, a peace settling over both wolf and man that neither had experienced in longer than either cared to admit. They sat together in comfortable silence as the storm raged and eventually passed, neither willing to release the other's hand until the last rumble of thunder faded into distant silence over the mountains. When Kian finally rose to leave, well past midnight, he paused at her door, looking back at her with an expression she had never seen him wear before, something unguarded and entirely genuine. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it, not just tonight." "You don't need to thank me," Alara said softly. "I told you once, everyone deserves company during their storms." He left her room that night with Thren quiet and content beneath his skin, and with a growing certainty in his own heart that whatever this had become between them, it was no longer something he could easily dismiss as simple necessity or gratitude. It was something far deeper and far more dangerous to a king whose enemies would seize any weakness they could find. Word spreads quickly within castle walls, faster than any messenger could carry it between territories, and it took less than a month for the whispers about the Alpha King's frequent visits to the East Wing to grow from quiet speculation into open conversation among the pack. It began, as these things often do, with small comments exchanged between servants carrying linens through the corridors. Comments about how often the king's chamber sat empty during evening hours, how the guards posted near the East Wing had grown accustomed to stepping aside without question when he passed. From the servants, the talk spread to the lower council members, and from there, inevitably, it reached the ears of the pack elders, the same elders who had spent months quietly discussing potential alliances through marriage, potential mates who could strengthen the northern territories through bloodline and political connection. Alara felt the shift long before anyone said a word to her directly. She noticed it in the way conversations quieted slightly when she entered a room, in the sidelong glances from healers she had once considered friendly colleagues, in the sharper tone some of the higher-ranking servants adopted when addressing her, as though her presence in the castle had suddenly become something requiring careful management rather than simple acceptance. She said nothing to Kian about it at first, unwilling to burden him with gossip when he already carried the weight of an entire pack's survival on his shoulders. But the whispers grew louder, and eventually, they could no longer be ignored. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. No storm in sight. While Alara made her rounds through the recovery wing checking on patients, she passed two younger servants near the linen closet, their voices dropping to hushed murmurs the moment they noticed her approach, though not quickly enough to avoid catching a fragment of their conversation. Human healer, of all people, spending her nights with the king. What could he possibly want with someone so far beneath his station? Maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe she's given him something to make him forget himself. There are herbs that do such things, aren't there? Ilara's steps faltered briefly, before she forced herself to continue walking, her face carefully neutral despite the sting the words left behind. She had faced worse in her life, had survived losses far greater than idle gossip from servants who understood nothing about the truth of her relationship with their king. Still, the accusation stung in ways she hadn't expected. The implication that whatever existed between herself and Kian could only be explained through manipulation rather than genuine connection. That evening, Kian arrived at her door, as had become his habit, though no storm had been forecast, simply because he had come to value her company, regardless of the weather. He noticed immediately that something weighed on her, her usual warmth, replaced by a careful, guarded distance that had not existed between them in weeks. "What's wrong?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "Nothing important," Ilara said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Ilara," she sighed, setting aside the book she had been pretending to read. "The staff have begun talking. About us. About why you visit so often. Some of it isn't kind." Kian's expression darkened slightly, though not with anger directed at her. "What are they saying?" "That I've somehow tricked you," Ilara said quietly. "Used herbs or manipulation to earn your favor, since apparently a human healer couldn't possibly hold your attention through any honest means." Anger flickered behind Kian's eyes, sharp and immediate, though he forced it down before it could take hold fully. "That's absurd. Anyone with half a mind would know such a thing isn't possible between true mates, let alone between a king and someone he simply values as company." The word slipped from him before he'd fully considered its weight, and Ilara's eyes widened slightly at the mention of mates, a topic neither of them had directly addressed, despite the growing closeness between them over recent months. "Kian," she said carefully, "we've never actually discussed what this is. Between us." He was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his next words carefully. "I know," he admitted finally. "I've been avoiding it, if I'm honest. Not because I doubt what I feel, but because acknowledging it makes everything more complicated than it already is. You know what I am, what I represent to my people. A king's mate isn't simply a personal choice. It's a political one, tied to alliances, to bloodlines, to the future stability of the entire Northern Territory. And I'm a human with no pack, no political value whatsoever," Ilara said, not bitterly, simply stating the reality they both understood. "That's not how I see you," Kian said firmly, "but it is how my council will see you, and I won't pretend that doesn't complicate things significantly." Ilara nodded slowly, absorbing this. "So what happens now? Do we simply continue pretending these visits mean nothing, while the entire castle whispers behind our backs about herbs and manipulation?" "No," Kian said, his voice firm with a conviction that surprised even himself. "I won't have my people believe such things about you. You've done nothing but show me kindness and honesty since the night I first stumbled into this room. Terrified and barely able to stand, I refuse to let gossip tarnish that. Then what will you do?" Kian considered the question carefully before answering. "For now, I'll speak with the council directly, address the rumors before they grow any further out of control. I won't reveal everything, not yet, not until I understand exactly how deep this connection between us truly runs. But I won't allow baseless accusations against your character to continue unchallenged either." Ilara felt a small measure of relief at his words, though uncertainty still lingered beneath it. "And Thren? What does he think about all of this?" A faint, wry smile crossed Kian's face at the question. "Thren decided how he felt about you long before I did, if I'm honest. He's been remarkably patient waiting for the rest of me to catch up." Despite the heaviness of the conversation, Ilara found herself smiling at that, a small warmth breaking through the tension that had settled over the room. "That's rather unfair to you, isn't it, being the last to understand your own feelings? Wolves are wiser than their human halves give them credit for, in matters like this," Kian said. "Though I suspect I've understood more than I've allowed myself to admit for some time now." The conversation shifted after that into quieter, gentler territory, the weight of the earlier gossip still present, but no longer suffocating between them. They spoke late into the evening, discussing possibilities neither had dared voice aloud before, the shape of a future that felt both impossibly complicated and, in quiet, private moments like this one, entirely worth pursuing, regardless of the obstacles ahead. Kian left her room that night with a clearer sense of purpose than he had carried in weeks, determined to address the growing rumors directly, rather than allowing them to fester unchecked. He did not yet know how deeply those same rumors had already reached beyond the walls of Blackridge Castle, carried through visiting delegations and traveling merchants to territories far beyond his own, eventually finding their way to ears that would seize upon the information, with far less benevolent intentions than idle castle gossip. Lady Cerys of the Thornfield Pack had been quietly courting an alliance with the Northern Territories for the better part of a year, hoping to secure her own position through marriage to the Alpha King and strengthen her family's influence across the region. News that Kian's attention had been captured by a human healer of no political standing whatsoever struck her not as harmless gossip, but as an opportunity, one she intended to use to her considerable advantage, the moment the timing proved right. Kian addressed the council 3 days later, calling an emergency session under the pretense of discussing border security, though everyone in attendance understood the true purpose behind the sudden meeting. He stood at the head of the long stone table, his expression composed and commanding, giving no outward indication of the careful strategy he had spent days preparing. "I've become aware," he began, his voice carrying easily across the chamber, "of rumors circulating among the staff regarding the healer Ilara and myself. I want to address this directly, rather than allow speculation to continue unchecked and potentially damage the reputation of a valued member of this pack." The elders exchanged glances around the table, several shifting uncomfortably in their seats at the directness of his approach. "The healer Ilara has provided genuine assistance to me during certain difficult moments," Kian continued carefully, choosing his words with precision. "I will not elaborate further on the nature of that assistance, as it remains a private matter. What I will say clearly is this: any suggestion that she has manipulated me through herbs, deception, or any dishonorable means is entirely false, and I expect such rumors to cease immediately." An older elder named Corwin cleared his throat cautiously. "My king, forgive the boldness, but the council has legitimate concerns beyond mere gossip. Your future mate carries significant political weight for the entire Northern Territory. Several alliances currently under discussion depend upon your eventual choice. If your attention has genuinely turned towards someone without pack standing, without political value to offer through her bloodline, the council would be remiss not to raise the matter directly." Kian had anticipated this challenge, though hearing it spoken aloud still tightened something in his chest. "I understand the council's concerns," he said carefully, "and I assure you, no decisions regarding my future mate have been finalized. I ask only that speculation regarding Alara's character be silenced, regardless of what other decisions I may eventually make." The meeting continued for another hour, discussion shifting toward genuine border matters, though the tension surrounding the earlier exchange lingered beneath the surface of every subsequent conversation. By the time the council dispersed, Kian felt reasonably satisfied that he had at least quieted the most damaging rumors, even if the underlying political pressure regarding his eventual mate remained entirely unresolved. He found Alara later that evening in the recovery wing, tending to a young soldier's wound with practiced efficiency. She looked up as he entered, offering a small, tired smile. "I heard about the council meeting," she said, once the soldier had been settled and they had a moment of relative privacy. "Edric mentioned it in passing. I did what I could," Kian said. "The worst of the gossip should quiet down now, at least regarding accusations against your character." "Thank you," Alara said sincerely, "though I imagine the political concerns remain." "They do," Kian admitted. "I won't pretend otherwise. The council has legitimate reasons to worry about alliances, about the stability such decisions bring to the entire territory. I can't simply dismiss those concerns, no matter how much I might wish to." Alara nodded slowly, absorbing this without visible distress, though Kian could sense the careful control she exercised over her own reaction. "I never expected anything different, Kian. I know what I am, and what I'm not, in terms of what a king's mate is typically meant to provide. That's not how I measure your worth," Kian said firmly, stepping closer. "Political value isn't the only thing that matters in choosing a life partner, regardless of what tradition demands." "Tradition doesn't care much about what matters to individuals," Alara said quietly. "It cares about what stabilizes packs and prevents wars." Kian had no immediate answer for that, the truth of her words settling uncomfortably in his chest. Before he could respond further, a sharp knock sounded at the recovery wing door, and Edric entered, looking notably tense. "My king, forgive the interruption. A delegation has arrived unexpectedly from the Thornfield pack. Lady Cerys herself leads the party, requesting an audience regarding matters of alliance." Kian's jaw tightened at the name. He had been vaguely aware of Thornfield's interest in strengthening ties with the Northern Territories, though he had not anticipated Lady Cerys arriving in person, and certainly not without proper notice beforehand. "Did she state the nature of her visit specifically?" "Only that it concerns matters of considerable importance to both territories," Edric said carefully. "She requests an audience this evening, my king." Kian glanced back at Alara, an unspoken understanding passing between them regarding the timing of this unexpected arrival, coming so soon after the council's discussion of his future mate. "I'll receive her in the main hall within the hour," he said finally, turning back to Edric. "See that appropriate arrangements are made." Edric bowed and departed quickly to relay the message. Kian remained a moment longer, studying Alara's carefully composed expression. "You should go," Alara said quietly, before he could speak. "Whatever she wants, it's clearly important enough to travel unannounced. You shouldn't keep a delegation waiting on my account." "Alara." "Go, Kian," she said, offering a small if somewhat strained smile. "We'll talk later. I have patients to check on regardless." Kian left reluctantly, the timing of Lady Cerys's arrival settling uneasily in his mind as he made his way toward the main hall to prepare for the unexpected audience. He could not shake the growing suspicion that this visit, arriving so precisely on the heels of council discussions regarding his mate and quieted rumors about Alara, was no mere coincidence. He was, unfortunately, entirely correct in that suspicion. Lady Cerys awaited him in the main hall when he arrived, dressed in fine traveling clothes despite the long journey, her posture perfectly composed, every inch the picture of practiced nobility. She rose gracefully as he entered, offering a deep, formal bow that carried just enough warmth to suggest genuine respect, alongside careful political calculation. "My king," she said, her voice smooth and pleasant. "Thank you for receiving me so quickly, and forgive the lack of prior notice. The matter felt urgent enough to warrant immediate travel, rather than waiting for formal correspondence to arrive." "Lady Cerys," Kian replied, settling into the throne positioned at the head of the hall. "What matter could possibly require such urgency?" Her smile sharpened just slightly at the question. calculated and confident. Simply an opportunity I believed you would want to hear about directly, my king, rather than through the usual channels of correspondence. It concerns strengthening the alliance between our two territories, and, if I'm being entirely honest, it concerns some rather interesting information I've received regarding certain private matters within your own castle walls. Kian's expression remained carefully neutral, though a cold weight settled in his stomach at her words. I'm listening. I understand, Lady Cerys continued smoothly, that you've formed quite a close attachment to a human healer residing here. Information travels quickly between territories, my king, particularly information as intriguing as this. I simply wish to discuss, privately of course, how such an attachment might be managed discreetly, in a way that protects both your reputation and the stability of the alliances your council so clearly values. The threat, though delivered with perfect courtesy, was unmistakable. Kian felt Thren stir uneasily beneath his skin, not from fear this time, but from something closer to protective anger, a fierce, immediate instinct to shield Alara from whatever game Lady Cerys intended to play. I fail to see what business my personal matters are of Thornfield's concern, Kian said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge beneath its calm surface. Perhaps not directly, Lady Cerys said, unbothered by his tone. But surely you understand, my king, that information such as this could prove complicated, if it reached ears less discreet than my own. I simply wish to offer my assistance in managing the situation before it grows beyond anyone's control. Kian studied her carefully, understanding perfectly well the calculated threat hidden beneath her polite offer of assistance. Whatever Lady Cerys truly wanted, it was clear she intended to use knowledge of his connection to Alara as leverage, one way or another, and Kian would need to move carefully if he hoped to protect the woman who had, without either of them fully realizing it until now, become far more important to him than he had ever intended to allow. Kian handled Lady Cerys carefully that evening, neither confirming nor denying the details of her information, offering only vague diplomatic reassurances that he would consider Thornfield's proposals regarding alliance in due time. She departed the following morning with a satisfied, knowing smile that left Kian deeply unsettled, certain that this was far from the last he would hear from her regarding the matter. He said nothing to Alara about the specifics of Lady Cerys's veiled threats, unwilling to burden her with worry over a political maneuver he hoped to resolve quietly through his own channels. It proved, in hindsight, a mistake born from good intentions but poor judgment, as the situation continued unraveling in ways neither of them anticipated over the following weeks. The castle's atmosphere shifted noticeably after Lady Cerys's visit, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious, as autumn deepened into the harsher edges of early winter. Council members grew more insistent in their questioning regarding Kian's intentions for a future mate, citing pressure from allied territories eager to see the Northern Pact's leadership secured through proper marriage. Servants who had once whispered idle gossip now spoke with something closer to genuine concern, sensing correctly that larger political forces had begun circling the situation. Alara felt the change most acutely in her daily work. Patients who had once welcomed her care now occasionally hesitated, influenced by rumors suggesting her continued presence in the castle threatened the stability of alliances vital to the entire Pact's protection. Other healers grew distant, uncertain how to navigate their colleagues' sudden, unwanted prominence within castle politics. It was during this tense period that Alara received an unexpected visitor of her own. She was organizing supplies in the recovery wing's storage room, one quiet afternoon, when a soft knock sounded at the open door. She turned to find Lady Cerys standing there, dressed simply for once, without the elaborate traveling clothes she had worn during her earlier visit, though her composed, calculating expression remained entirely unchanged. "Lady Cerys," Alara said carefully, straightening from her work. "I wasn't aware you had returned to Blackridge." "A brief visit," Lady Cerys said smoothly, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her with deliberate quiet. "I wanted to speak with you directly, healer to healer, if you'll permit the informality." Alara said nothing, watching the noblewoman with careful, guarded attention. "I understand you've grown quite close to the king," Lady Cerys continued, moving further into the small room, examining the neatly organized shelves of herbs and supplies with idle curiosity. "A remarkable achievement, given your rather humble origins, though I imagine you've begun to notice the difficulties such closeness has created within these walls." I'm not interested in games, Lady Saris, Elara said evenly. If you have something specific to say, please say it directly. A thin smile crossed Lady Saris's lips at the bluntness. Very well. Directly then. You must understand that whatever affection exists between yourself and King Kian cannot possibly survive the political reality of his position. He requires a mate who brings genuine value to the Northern Territory, someone who strengthens alliances rather than complicating them. You, my dear, bring nothing but complication. That's not your decision to make, Elara said, her voice steady despite the sting of the words. Perhaps not entirely, Lady Saris agreed, but it will become the Council's decision, and eventually the King's own decision, once the true cost of continuing this connection becomes clear. I simply wish to offer you the opportunity to leave gracefully, before matters grow more painful for everyone involved, yourself especially. Is that a threat? It's a kindness, Lady Saris said smoothly. I would hate to see you humiliated publicly when the King inevitably chooses duty over personal preference, as every good alpha eventually must. Leave quietly now, and you preserve your dignity. Stay, and force his hand publicly, and I promise you the outcome will be far less pleasant for someone with no pack, no political protection, and no standing whatsoever to defend yourself against what follows. Elara felt anger rising sharply in her chest, though she forced herself to remain outwardly calm, refusing to give Lady Saris the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. I appreciate your concern for my dignity, she said evenly. But I think I'll make my own decisions regarding my future, Lady Saris. Kian's choices are his own to make as well. Lady Saris's expression cooled considerably at the refusal, any pretense of friendliness vanishing entirely. Very well. I had hoped to resolve this discreetly, for everyone's benefit. Unfortunately, you've left me little choice but to pursue other means of ensuring this matter reaches an appropriate conclusion. She left without further explanation, the quiet threat hanging heavily in the air behind her. Elara stood alone in the storage room for several long minutes afterward, her hands trembling slightly despite her earlier composure, the full weight of Lady Saris's implied threat settling uncomfortably over her. She debated for hours whether to tell Kian about the visit, ultimately deciding that keeping silent, as he had apparently done regarding whatever threats Lady Saris had made during her first visit, served neither of them well. She found him that evening in his private study, reviewing border reports by candlelight, and relayed the conversation carefully, watching his expression darken progressively as she spoke. She threatened you directly, Kian said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, once Elara finished recounting the exchange. She offered me a choice, framed as kindness, Elara said. Leave quietly, or face whatever consequences she intends to arrange otherwise. This is my fault, Kian said, rising from his desk, frustration evident in every line of his tense posture. I should have told you about her earlier visit, about the threats she made then. I thought I could handle this quietly, without dragging you further into the political mess my position creates. You can't protect me from everything, Kian, Elara said gently, not when the threat comes from within your own political circles. I can protect you from this, Kian said firmly, turning to face her directly. I won't allow Lady Saris, or anyone else, to threaten someone under my protection without consequence. Whatever she intends to do next, I'll be ready for it. And if she exposes your fear of storms publicly? Elara asked quietly. That's clearly what she's threatening, isn't it? Using knowledge of your vulnerability to force you into abandoning me, or forcing my hand to leave willingly before she reveals it herself. Kian's jaw tightened at the direct acknowledgement of the fear he had spent his entire life carefully concealing. Yes, he admitted, that's precisely what she's threatening. Then perhaps, Elara said slowly, an idea forming even as she spoke it aloud. The only way to remove her leverage entirely is to take away the secret she's using against you. Kian stared at her, understanding slowly dawning in his eyes. You're suggesting I reveal it myself, before she can use it as a weapon. I'm suggesting, Elara said carefully, that a secret only holds power over you as long as it remains hidden. The moment you speak it aloud yourself, on your own terms, it stops being a weapon anyone else can wield against you. My people have spent over a decade believing their king is untouchable, Kian said quietly. Revealing this could shatter that entirely. It could weaken every alliance my father built, every bit of respect I've earned through strength alone. Or, Elara said gently, it could show your people something even more valuable than untouchable strength, It could show them a king honest enough to admit his own fears, strong enough to face them anyway, every single time a storm arrives. That's not weakness, Kian. That's the truest form of courage there is. Kian considered her words carefully, the weight of the decision settling heavily over him, as thunder, distant but unmistakable, began rolling faintly across the mountains outside his window once more. Lady Saris did not wait long to act. Within a week, word arrived that she intended to return to Blackridge once more, this time requesting a full council session rather than a private audience. Citing matters of alliance she claimed required the entire pack leadership's attention. Kian understood immediately what she truly intended, recognizing the move for what it was, an opportunity to expose his secret publicly, before the full weight of the Northern Council, in a setting designed to inflict maximum damage to his authority and force his hand regarding Elara. He spent the days leading up to the session in careful preparation, consulting quietly with Edric and a small handful of advisors he trusted absolutely, weighing the risks of revealing his fear voluntarily against the far greater danger of having it exposed by an enemy seeking to manipulate the outcome entirely to her own advantage. Elara remained a steady presence throughout those difficult days, offering quiet support without ever pushing him toward a decision he needed to make entirely on his own terms. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else could, the enormous weight of what he was being asked to consider, the possibility of dismantling in a single evening the careful image he had spent over a decade constructing. "Whatever you decide," she told him, the night before the council session, as they sat together in his private study, long after most of the castle had gone quiet, "I'll support it. This isn't my decision to make for you." "I know," Kian said, staring into the fire crackling in the hearth, "but I find myself wanting your opinion regardless." Elara considered this carefully before answering. "I think your people already respect you deeply, Kian. Not because they believe you're incapable of fear, but because they've watched you lead them wisely through every genuine crisis this territory has faced. I think you're underestimating how much that respect could withstand honesty, if given the chance to prove itself. And if you're wrong? Then we face whatever comes next together," she said simply. "But I don't think I'm wrong. I've watched how the wounded soldiers speak of you, how the servants describe your fairness, even when they don't realize I'm listening. Fear of a storm doesn't erase any of that. It simply makes the rest of it more remarkable, knowing you've carried this burden silently the entire time you were earning their trust." Kian said nothing further that night, but her words settled deeply within him, turning over slowly as he prepared himself for whatever the following day's council session might bring. The great hall was fuller than usual the next evening, every council member present, alongside several visiting delegates, including Lady Saris herself, seated with practiced composure near the front of the assembly, a satisfied confidence evident in her expression as she waited for the proceedings to begin. Kian took his place at the head of the hall, Elara standing quietly near the side entrance where she had been asked to wait, uncertain exactly how the evening would unfold but present regardless, unwilling to let him face whatever came alone. Lady Saris rose first when the formal proceedings began, addressing the assembled council with practiced eloquence. "My king, esteemed council members, I come before you tonight with information I believe deeply relevant to the continued stability and strength of the Northern Territories. Information regarding our king's fitness to lead, and regarding certain vulnerabilities that I fear may have been concealed from this council for far too long." Murmurs spread quickly through the assembled crowd, elders exchanging uneasy glances at the ominous framing of her words. Kian felt Thren stir beneath his skin, not with the familiar panic of an approaching storm, but with something steadier, a fierce, protective resolve that had been building within him since the conversation with Elara the night before. "Before you continue, Lady Saris," Kian said, his voice cutting clearly across the murmuring hall, silencing the room instantly, "I believe I should address this matter myself, rather than allow it to be presented through the framing of someone with clear political motivation to damage my standing." Lady Saris's composed expression flickered with visible surprise, clearly having not anticipated Kian seizing control of the narrative before she could deliver her carefully planned exposure. The hall fell into complete silence, every eye fixed upon their king as he stepped forward, his posture straight and unwavering despite the enormous weight of what he was about to reveal. "For over 20 years, Kian began, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability of his words, I have carried a secret I believed, until recently, would destroy everything my father built if it ever became known. My wolf, Thren, carries a deep and lasting fear of storms, a fear rooted in a childhood incident that neither time nor discipline has ever fully erased. The silence in the hall deepened further, shock evident on nearly every face present, elders and delegates alike, absorbing the unprecedented admission from a king they had always believed entirely beyond such vulnerability. I have hidden this fear through careful concealment for my entire adult life, Kian continued, believing, as my father taught me, that any weakness shown by our leadership would be seized upon by enemies eager to destabilize everything we've built. I concealed it from all of you. I concealed it, for a time, even from myself, refusing to acknowledge it as anything beyond a flaw requiring absolute suppression. He paused, glancing briefly toward Alara, who watched from the side of the hall with quiet, steady support in her expression, giving him the strength to continue. Several months ago, during a violent storm, I found refuge, entirely by chance, in the chambers of our healer, Alara. She witnessed my fear firsthand, and rather than judgment or exploitation, she offered only steady kindness and quiet understanding. In the months since, her presence has become the one true source of calm I've found against a fear I once believed unconquerable. Lady Saris's expression had shifted from surprise into something closer to alarm, recognizing quickly that Kian's voluntary confession had stripped away entirely the leverage she had intended to wield against him. I share this, not because Lady Saris has forced my hand, Kian continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, but because I have come to believe, through Alara's counsel and my own reflection, that true strength lies not in the absence of fear, but in the willingness to face it honestly, time and again, regardless of how difficult that honesty proves to be. I have led this territory faithfully through every genuine crisis it has faced. That fact remains unchanged by tonight's revelation. The hall remained silent for a long moment following his words, the weight of the confession settling over the assembled council. Then, slowly, one of the eldest council members, a wolf named Aldrich who had served since Kian's father's reign, rose from his seat. "My king," Aldrich said carefully, "I have watched you lead this pack since you were barely old enough to bear the title. I have seen you make difficult decisions under enormous pressure, decisions that protected every soul within these walls. This revelation changes nothing about the respect I hold for your leadership. If anything, it deepens it, knowing the burden you've carried silently all these years." Murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the hall, though not universal. Several delegates and council members exchanging uncertain glances, clearly still processing the unprecedented admission. Lady Saris, sensing her carefully planned advantage crumbling entirely, rose quickly, attempting to salvage some remaining leverage from the situation. "Regardless of the king's admirable honesty," she said, her voice carrying a sharper edge now, "the matter of an appropriate mate for the northern throne remains entirely unresolved. Surely the council cannot ignore that a human healer, however kind her intentions, brings no political value whatsoever to secure this territory's future alliances." Kian turned to face her directly, something resolute settling firmly into his expression. "On that matter, Lady Saris, I intend to make my position equally clear tonight, before this entire council, so that no further doubt or manipulation can be attempted regarding my intentions going forward." Kian's words hung heavily in the air as every eye in the great hall turned toward him, waiting for what would come next. He glanced once more toward Alara, standing quietly near the side entrance, her expression carefully composed, despite the obvious tension of the moment, and something settled firmly within him, a certainty that had been building for months, finally crystallizing into resolve. "I understand the council's concerns regarding political alliance," Kian said, addressing the assembled elders and delegates directly. "I understand the value tradition places on a mate chosen for strategic advantage rather than personal preference. My father built this territory's strength through careful, calculated alliances, and I do not dismiss the wisdom in that approach lightly." He paused, drawing a steady breath before continuing. "But I have also come to believe, through months of quiet reflection and through Alara's steady presence in my life, that a leader's strength comes not only from strategic alliances, but from the clarity and honesty with which he faces his own life, his own fears, and his own heart. I will not choose a mate based solely on political calculation, when I have already found someone whose honesty, courage, and steady kindness have shown me more about true strength than any alliance ever could. Lady Cerys's expression tightened further, recognizing the direction of his words even before he spoke them explicitly. Alara has never once sought advantage from her connection to me, Kian continued. She has never asked for political standing, for wealth, or for influence over this council's decisions. She offered me steady company during my darkest, most vulnerable moments, expecting nothing in return beyond simple honesty. That is not nothing, Lady Cerys. That is, in fact, everything a true mate should offer. Thren stirred beneath his skin, not with fear this time, but with fierce, steady certainty, a wolf finally acknowledging openly what he had understood instinctively for months. I have decided, Kian said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, that Alara will be recognized, formally and publicly, as my chosen mate, and future queen of the Northern Territories, should she accept that position. A collective murmur swept through the hall, shock and surprise evident on many faces, though notably, several council members, Aldrich among them, nodded slowly with quiet approval rather than dismay. Lady Cerys opened her mouth as though to protest further, but the shifting mood of the assembled crowd made clear that her earlier leverage had entirely evaporated, replaced instead by growing respect for a king willing to speak such difficult truths openly before his own people. Kian crossed the hall then, moving directly toward Alara, who watched his approach with wide, stunned eyes, clearly not having anticipated such a public declaration in the midst of what she had expected to be simply a defense against Lady Cerys's threats. Kian, she said quietly, as he stopped before her, you don't have to do this so publicly, so suddenly. We could have discussed this privately first. I know, he said, taking her hands gently in his own, entirely unconcerned with the hundreds of watching eyes throughout the hall. But I find I'm done hiding things that matter, simply because they might complicate my position. You once told me a secret only holds power over you as long as it stays hidden. I think the same is true of feelings worth having. Alara's eyes glistened slightly, though she maintained her composure despite the overwhelming weight of the moment. And if the council refuses to accept this decision, then we face that challenge together, as we've faced everything else these past months, Kian said firmly. But I don't intend to spend the rest of my reign pretending the most honest, steady thing in my life is something to be ashamed of, or hidden away. Aldrich rose once more from among the council, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. My king, for what it's worth, this elder council member offers his full support for your decision. A leader honest enough to admit his fears, and wise enough to recognize true worth beyond mere political calculation, is precisely the kind of leadership this territory needs for the future ahead. Several other council members voiced similar support, though a handful remained visibly hesitant, clearly still processing the unprecedented turn the evening had taken. Lady Cerys, recognizing the tide had turned decisively against whatever advantage she had hoped to gain, offered a stiff, formal bow before departing the hall entirely, her earlier confidence replaced by cold, bitter acceptance of her failed maneuver. The following weeks proved challenging in their own right, as word of Kian's public declaration spread rapidly beyond Blackridge's walls, reaching every corner of the Northern Territories and several neighboring pacts beyond. Some allied territories expressed genuine concern regarding the political implications of a human queen, worried about precedent and tradition being upended so dramatically. Others, surprisingly, expressed quiet admiration for a king brave enough to choose honesty and genuine partnership over pure political calculation. Alara faced her own share of difficulties during this transition, adjusting to a role she had never anticipated occupying, learning the complex political demands expected of a future queen, while simultaneously earning the trust of skeptical council members and pack citizens uncertain about her sudden elevation in status. Kian remained a steady presence throughout, supporting her transition exactly as she had supported him through his own vulnerable moments during their earlier months together. Storms continued to arrive throughout that winter, as storms always do, and Kian no longer hid his reaction to them, no longer retreated secretly to quiet corners of the castle hoping no one would notice his absence. Instead, he faced each storm openly, sometimes surrounded by trusted advisors who had come to understand and respect his honesty, and always, without fail, with Alara steady beside him, her calm presence anchoring him through fear that, while never fully vanishing, had grown considerably easier to bear, with genuine support, rather than isolated concealment. Thren settled more completely with each passing storm, the ancient fear rooted so deeply in childhood trauma, gradually losing its overwhelming power, not because it disappeared entirely, but because it no longer had to be carried alone, in silence, behind a mask of false invincibility. Spring arrived slowly across the northern mountains, melting the last stubborn patches of snow along the ridgelines, and coaxing the first green shoots from the frozen ground surrounding Blackridge Castle. With it came the day the entire territory had spent months anticipating, the formal ceremony that would recognize Alara not simply as the king's chosen companion, but as the true and rightful queen of the northern Pax. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion, banners bearing the northern crest, hanging alongside simpler decorations that Alara herself had requested. Sprigs of early wildflowers and herbs gathered from the surrounding hills, a small personal touch that reminded everyone present of exactly where her heart truly belonged, even as she stepped into a role far grander than anything she had imagined for herself. Kian stood at the head of the hall, dressed in formal ceremonial attire, watching the doors at the far end with an anticipation he had rarely allowed himself to feel so openly in his adult life. Thren hummed steadily beneath his skin, calm and content, entirely unlike the anxious creature who had once trembled at the mere suggestion of an approaching storm. The doors opened, and Alara entered, dressed simply but elegantly, her dark hair partially braided with the same wildflowers that decorated the hall, her expression a careful mixture of nervousness and quiet determination. She walked the length of the hall alone, having insisted months earlier that she wanted no one else's hand guiding her forward, wanting to claim this new role entirely on her own terms, just as she had claimed every other difficult step in her life since arriving at Blackridge, with nothing but her healing skills and quiet resilience. Aldrich, who had become an unexpected but steady ally throughout the transition, presided over the formal ceremony, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall as he spoke the traditional words binding a king and his chosen mate before the assembled pack. Do you, Kian Ashraver, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, choose Alara as your mate and queen, promising to honor, protect, and stand beside her through every storm life may bring? I do, Kian said, his voice steady and certain, the words carrying a weight far beyond mere ceremonial tradition, given everything the phrase truly meant between the two of them. And do you, Alara, accept this position, choosing Kian as your mate and king, promising the same honor, protection, and steady partnership in return? I do, Alara said, her voice equally steady, despite the emotion evident in her expression. The hall erupted into genuine cheers as Kian took her hands in his own, the formal ceremony complete, though the true significance of their bond had been sealed months earlier, in a quiet room during a violent storm, long before either of them had understood exactly what was beginning to grow between them. As the celebration continued late into the evening, feast tables filling the great hall with warmth and laughter, Kian found a quiet moment to step away with Alara, onto a small balcony overlooking the mountains, the same mountains that had, for over 2 decades, carried the storms he once feared, more than any battle or political threat he'd ever faced. Regretting the decision yet? Kian asked lightly, watching her study the darkening sky with quiet contemplation. Never, Alara said, leaning against him comfortably. Though I confess, becoming queen wasn't exactly the future I imagined for myself when your soldiers found me half frozen on that border road. Life rarely follows the paths we imagine, Kian said. Sometimes the unexpected paths lead somewhere far better than anything we could have planned. They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching clouds gather faintly along the distant peaks, the first hint of a spring storm building somewhere beyond the horizon. Kian felt the familiar tightness begin in his chest at the sight, an old habit not entirely erased by months of healing and honest partnership. Storm's coming, Alara observed quietly, noticing the shift in his posture immediately, her healer's instincts as sharp as ever. I know, Kian said, though his voice carried none of the old panic that had once defined these moments entirely. But I find I'm not nearly as afraid as I used to be. No? No, he said, turning to look at her directly. Because I know exactly where I'll be when it arrives. Beside you. Just as I intend to be for every storm that follows. for the rest of our lives together." Alara smiled, reaching up to gently touch his face, an easy, natural gesture that would have seemed impossible to imagine on the night they first met, when a terrified king had stumbled into her room, seeking nothing more than a quiet place to hide his deepest secret. "Then let it come," she said softly. "We'll face it exactly like we've faced everything else, together." The first distant rumble of thunder sounded faintly across the mountains as they stood together on the balcony, and for the first time in over 20 years, Kian did not flinch, did not tense, did not feel the familiar rising panic that had once controlled him so completely. Thren remained calm and steady beneath his skin, secure in the knowledge that whatever fear remained no longer needed to be carried alone, hidden behind careful masks and desperate concealment. He was, at last, entirely and genuinely unafraid, not because the fear had vanished completely, but because he had finally found someone steady enough to help him carry it, storm after storm, for as long as they both should live. The Northern Territories thrived in the years that followed, strengthened not by calculated political alliance, but by a king and queen whose partnership was built on genuine honesty, mutual respect, and the quiet, steady courage to face even the deepest fears together, rather than alone. And those storms continued to roll across the mountains every season without fail. The Alpha King never again needed to hide from them in secret. He simply opened the door to his queen's chambers, exactly as he had that very first night, and found there, waiting for him always, the steady, unwavering comfort of someone who had never once seen his fear as weakness, but had recognized it instead for exactly what it truly was, the beginning of the deepest, most honest love either of them would ever know.